This is the Open University.
That's a silly opening for a serious topic. I want to talk about over-touristification today. I kind of object to that word, over-touristification, because it implies that being a tourist is a problem, a bad thing for the world, for one's community, or for oneself even. And I detect it as a kind of another prong on the general attack on globalization and multiculturalism and pluralism, which we've been seeing since the 90s and which has been gathering force. And it's also slightly deceptive because it's a left-wing attack. Usually we see right-wing attacks on multiculturalism especially. This is a way for left-wing people to have their grumble about the global order, is to say that tourism is ruining cities like Paris. Here I am in Paris, living on a kind of tourist attraction, which is the Marché d'Aligre in the 12th arrondissement. And it's fantastic for me. I essentially am a tourist here. I come here and I spend a couple of weeks a month maybe overlooking this market and rummaging through the old books and things. Touristification, one of the aspects of it is that it focuses on the past. And this is something people reproach it for, that cities are preserved in aspic. Paris is a good example of that. All the tourists make their way to the Louvre and the Palais Royal and all the rest of it and try to imagine that they're living in the 18th century or the 19th century. The same with Venice. And I'm kind of a sucker for that, for the tourist point of view there, because I do think the past is a valuable repository of alternative ways of looking at the world. Somebody posted on Facebook today that 90% of the French media is controlled by 9 individuals who are not by any means typical French people. You can see the huge, tight control, no matter what variety there seems to be in the programming on TV and radio, in newspapers, whatever. Nevertheless, that is the reality behind it. It's actually much less variety than it looks like. And I see the media of the past, like the books being sold on the tables outside on the square there, as a kind of escape from that monoculture. Of course, you could say, well, those books are also the product of a very elitist media control structure, which reflected the interests and the enthusiasms of the dominant classes of the time, sure. But there have been enough various different times and various different class situations, economic arrangements in history for that to be a kind of pluralism. It's better than what we have now, I don't want to have my cultural agenda dominated by the Tarantinos and the Madonnas and whoever is getting boosted currently. I want to have a huge panoply of different perspectives, and I will find kindred voices and spirits in the work of writers in the past. So I kind of make no apology for being retro, as tourists are retro. But it reminds me of something that Morrissey, God, that idiot Morrissey, politically an appalling person now. But he said in the 80s that being a celebrity was the only way to be treated properly as a citizen. And I remember when I lived in Paris before, I used to hang out with Philippe Catherine, who's actually a really interesting musician with a very quirky spirit and fantastic inventive songs, satirical songs, a lot of them. He used to say that because he came from Nantes, he would come into Paris and feel very much like a tourist in Paris, and that he relished that freedom. It is a fantastic freedom. And I have to say that in a time of huge uncertainty about my citizenship status, and this has been dangling over the heads of people like me since the Brexit referendum 2016, one could have, absolutely chewed oneself to death with the worry about whether one was able to legally reside wherever one's living in continental Europe as a British person after Brexit goes through, if it ever goes through. It seems increasingly likely that it will. I've chosen not to worry about that because essentially I've been living as a tourist. I've been literally living on a tourist visa for the last decade or so, or if not longer. I I live in Berlin, but I don't have legal status in Berlin. But I continue to be calm about that. It's fine. As long as there is the protected status of being a tourist, as long as I'm allowed to continue to say, hey, I'm a tourist and I will leave within 90 days, and as long as I get something like 90 days, of course that time has been reducing. Okay, we can look at the history of passports and visas and things and say that in the 19th century you kind of didn't need one. You could go all over the world and there wasn't really this passport border check thing. Travel was pretty unusual. It was a privilege, or it was the last resort of the economic migrants and people. But it's a kind of 20th century invention, and Brecht famously said that it was easier to produce a human being than to produce a passport. It actually, procuring those papers and proving you are who you are has become increasingly difficult. I was reading a piece about academics and researchers trying to get visas to visit conferences in the US, and them saying how increasingly difficult that has become for them just since Trump took over. A lot of these applications are rejected because you say on Twitter you're a communist, or because you've been to visit Syria as part of your researches, because you have a Muslim-sounding name, all sorts of things. And this is, of course, cutting off the sources of the oxygen of freedom, the oxygen of intelligence from the United States, and making the US, as I said in my last video, an increasingly provincial and boring place. I deeply resent this, but of course as a kind of leftist myself, oops, I won't get my US visa now to go and promote my book. Oh hell, why did I say I was a leftist? I should have said I want to buy Greenland instead. I can appreciate some of the dimensions of the attacks on over-touristification. For instance, my brother-in-law's brother, in other words, the brother of the man my sister married and had some of her children with, oh, it's all complicated in my family, runs a website called Bella Caledonia. He's called Mike Small. And I'm very much in tune with his political views. I think he's a fantastic force for good in Scotland. And he says, he ran a video recently by a guy called Bonnie Prince Ball.
The Edinburgh Festival is a spectacular exercise of lies, hype and profiteering. An annual occupation by cunts for cunts. The Edinburgh Festival is not something done by Edinburgh, it is something done to Edinburgh. And many people, well, me for one, have had enough.
And the thrust of his argument is that there should be tax money raised by the influx of tourists, cultural tourists from Edinburgh and other countries, and from England rather, and other countries during the festival, to be put through into cultural activities for Scottish people. This is the usual kind of sour and dour attitude of the festival by Scots. My fellow Scots, some of them have a chip on their shoulder about there being a cultural event at all, which they then justify by saying this money could provide our own cultural events. But left to their own devices, probably they wouldn't be doing certainly anything as big as the Edinburgh Festival. It has to be an international, that is in the title, the Edinburgh International Festival. It has to be international. There has to be an element of parachuting, and there has to be a sense of, okay, these cultivated and rather highfalutin people do parachute in, descend on the capital like locusts or whatever you want to compare them to. But I begin to worry when the insect comparisons, metaphors start to come in, because then you start talking about foreigners as cockroaches and all the Hitler rhetoric that goes with that. But Mike Small does have a good point talking about Airbnb in Edinburgh. For instance, Edinburgh has 11,000 Airbnbs now with a population of 485,000. That means there's an Airbnb for every 48 people in Edinburgh, which is twice as many per person, per citizen, as London has. And their entire property, 7,000 of them are entire properties. And some of them are rooms, 4,000 are rooms. And the vast majority pay no tax to the council whatsoever. So the local art scene is not getting money. We're not building Bilbao, Guggenheim type buildings in Edinburgh on the back of the festival. Airbnb is the official partner of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, so you can see that there is a connection. Obviously, Edinburgh's economy is booming during the festival time, and I'm in favour of European Union initiatives like the Manifesta Culture event, which is held every couple of years in a different, usually regional and underdeveloped part of Europe. It was in Palermo in Sicily last time. I've seen it in, I missed that one, but I've seen it in this sort of abandoned coal mining areas of Belgium, in northern Italy, in the Alps around Bolzano, various places. And that's a fantastic way to occupy old industrial spaces with culture. And of course, it's not for the local people. The alpine people of Bolzano probably don't want to go and see the Rax Video Collective, videos in a former smelting factory. They would probably prefer that it was still smelting steel. Tough shit, It is going to redevelop your region. It's going to make it more of a tourist map kind of thing. It's the way that our economies are going, despite the backlash against globalization and multiculturalism. There is at the same time an economic liberalism to do with cheap airlines, cheap flights, the increasing possibility of mobility, lower working hours, for people. And I'm not convinced that cities are ruined by tourism. Quite the contrary. If you look at Paris, what's happened in Paris, for instance, pretty much every day when I'm here, I go along on my electric scooter, my zero emissions vehicle, along the Paris Plage, which is the banks of the river. It used to be a horrible, congested automobile route, that 20th century technology which we're trying to root out from our cities currently. It's fantastic now that it's opened up to people, pedestrians and bicycles and small electric vehicles like my scooter, my whatever it's called, Tsingtao. It's going to call it Tsingtao, but that's beer, of course. And that's all to the good. And another thing I find is that tourists are very conformist, very herd-minded people who still follow their Baedekers and their blue guides to the official designated tourist sites and don't really bother you when they're kind of in other places. So even in Venice, which is a very small place, sure, when these massive liners disgorge their passengers, there are groups of people, and there are groups everywhere on the main thoroughfares following the leader with the umbrella and getting the official guide. But then you can go off the main streets in Venice and there are cul-de-sacs everywhere, there are little alleys leading up to canals, there are back streets, there are back routes which the tourists never actually go to because they're such sheep. So really you don't have to have your experience of Venice ruined. There are little flea markets which tourists almost never discover. So I've got my own alternative. Now, having gone to Venice as a tourist pretty much every year, I've got my own little alternative map in my mind of the Venice you can experience. That's not to say that it deals with the problem of the liners and the problem of Airbnb. If you want to do that, absolutely do that and control Airbnb the way the German government has done by saying that it's forbidden in Berlin, for instance, to rent a whole apartment. You're only allowed to rent a room in an apartment you yourself live in, and that stops the rents from going up for everybody in the city. Also, control the rents, the way that the Berlin government, again, is doing by putting a freeze on rent increases over the next 5 years, or having actually buying back stock from the big companies which have been renting out and hiking the prices. You can do these things if you have the political will. What you need is a population that believes that they are important, which we do have in Berlin because we have largely a leftist population which believes in these anti-capitalist measures. Fine, do all that. That is absolutely fantastic if you do that. Control tourism in those ways. Not just tourism, though. This is the thing that gets me about the arguments of that Billy Bob fellow, Bunny Prince Bob, is that this kind of thing, the grenade he's lobbing into the festival, is a grenade you can lob into. You could lob into football with all the more validity. You could say football is a grotesque spectacle of a spectacular exercise of lies, hype, and profiteering. Of course it is. We live in capitalism. Football is all rigged, and it's all about big bucks and things. Do I hear him attacking the football system? No, I don't. Attack your local shopping centre as a spectacular exercise of lies, hype and profiteering. That's its whole raison d'etre, is profiteering. I mean, pretty much everything that exists in capitalism can be attacked on those grounds, that it doesn't help local people, blah, blah, blah. So why single out a cultural festival, which is actually... I mean, also I can see many aesthetic, valid critiques of the Edinburgh Festival, that it's become increasingly about big tent comedians and and all the rest of it. You know, it's aesthetically not as interesting as it used to be. All that is absolutely valid criticism to make, but don't attack it just because it's a tourist phenomenon. My future is increasingly tied up with being a tourist. I would love to buy a house in Japan, for instance, and I will probably have to continue living there as a tourist on tourist visas and just continue being mobile and leaving every 90 days, which is how I lived in Japan for the last 7 years. What's fantastic about that is that you're not treated like some kind of sucker or stooge. You know, I sometimes feel that local people are weighed down with all these, you know, utilities bills and all sorts of things which tourists are kind of like children. They're allowed to play. You're allowed to preserve your innocence and your sense of play, your sense of delight in simple pleasures as a tourist, which you're not as a householder and a citizen. You tend to be bullied by officialdom, unfortunately, as these other categories of person. So I'm very keen not to be bullied. I don't know, it's just something I've always tried to avoid. Having seen the dark soul of man as a boarding school boy at an Edinburgh school, you know, I've seen that people will bully you and will exploit you if given half the chance. And so being a tourist is a way to be light, to sort of own nothing but experience everything, and to float from one context to another, and to get this kind of polyvalent multicultural perspective on things, and then to start comparing. You know, people who don't ever leave their country tend to say, I live in the best country in the world, until they start traveling, and then they realize there's lots of other fantastic ways to organize life and society. And so that's the kind of person I am, you know, willy-nilly. I've lived in enough places from childhood on to not really feel any silly loyalty to one. Of course, if everyone were like me, I don't know if the world would be better if everyone were a tourist and just moved around constantly and lived in different places. I do feel I'm leaping from one toppling domino to the next. That it's constantly this kind of idea of freedom, a libertarian idea of freedom, and perhaps an irresponsible and childish one, is increasingly difficult, but at the same time increasingly easy. I don't know. It's both. The local is the local and the global. We are, despite the backlash, we are living in times when there is increased global access, and I can, with my British passport, which is lucky for me, you know, for the time being, it's a powerful passport. I don't know if it will continue to be when we fragment into many tiny states, and you know, you have an English or a Scottish passport. We'll have to see what the Scottish passport entitles me to. But at the moment, I'm enjoying the increasing mobility and increasing leisure possibilities, even just renting. I mean, I now own an electric scooter, but before that, or if I don't choose to take that out, I can rent one and have that mobility, that individual mobility in the city. And there was a free-for-all for a year, and then it was sort of regulated, and now it's extremely regulated. You can't park the Lime scooters in large swathes of the Paris Plage area, for instance, because they're close to bridges. And it actually, there is a kind of radar system, or it's just based on the mapping, the GPS positioning that the scooter has built into it, that cuts your engine if you're in an area where you should be going slow because there are a lot of pedestrians. It actually doesn't give you the... Do they do this to cars? No, they don't. Cars driving through the city, you'd think that, why can't they do that and cut the car's engine down to 5 kilometers per hour so that they don't hurt people on the street? No, they don't do that. They only do that to these e-scooters, which are by far the most sociable and environmentally friendly form of transport in Paris. They cut you down to a speed of 5 kilometers per hour for large sections of that Paris Plage. Of course, that's where having your own one is a great advantage, because they can't cut your own engine. Anyway, yes, tourism, don't knock it. I'm seeing a lot of articles in papers and things about this phenomenon of how tourism is ruining everything. I don't buy that. I really think someone should be standing up for tourism, and that person today is me.
Open University.